Villainous Heroics by I Believe in a Happily Ever After on AO3. Chapter 18. Hisashi didn't have to open his eyes to know he was in a hospital. Even without his glasses or hearing aids, it was all too easy to pick up on the overly bright lights, the smell of bleach, antiseptics, and blood, and the feeling of an uncomfortable bed that was just on the side of too firm. Considering he hadn't been in a hospital since he was a teenager, it took him a few groggy seconds to try and figure out what he had done to end up there. Maybe the stove at his job had exploded, and that meant he no longer had to deal with his villain of a boss. That would be worth the trip to the hospital. Geez, he hurt a lot worse than when his shoulder had been shot while doing his hero work. His throat and neck especially hurt, which usually meant he had overused his quirk, and Hisashi jerked up at realizing what must have happened, biting back a stream as he nearly tore his arm out of his socket, hazily vision focusing on where a silver pair of handcuffs, quirk suppressant cuffs, was keeping him chained to the hospital bed by the arm that wasn't hooked up in wires and medical equipment. Right, right, okay. Hisashi could think about this calmly. First, he didn't see his glasses anywhere, but that could just be because he couldn't really see to find them. The bright lights weren't helping his headaches either, so Hisashi closed his eyes and tried to take a few deep breaths. As it turned out, that was a very bad idea because his throat suddenly felt like it was on fire. It took everything he had on him not to fall into a coughing fit because that. He was certain would just make things bad enough if he just would start crying. Hisashi really didn't want to start crying while in a hospital. Getting control of himself, he noticed that his hearing aids were gone, too. Overall, he was unable to see, unable to hear, chained to a bed, and the pain from his throat felt like it was ready to tear him apart. Suffice to say, Hisashi mused, he must have a very bad day. It wasn't until he was starting to calm himself down that Hisashi remembered what exactly had happened before he woke up in the hospital. The details were fuzzy at that moment, but Hisashi remembered enough to know that all of Japan, and by extension the police, knew who he was and knew him as nothing more than a villain. How depressing. At least he had survived the fight, he realized. There was almost an forgettable memory of Aizawa coming to his rescue, and considering Hisashi was sure he hadn't had brain damage at the time, that probably meant it was true. Good. That meant the kids must be safe and those villains dealt with. Attempting to crack his eyes open again, Hisashi took a glance around the room he was in. There was no windows, the door was firmly shut, the lights were annoyingly on, and he was the only bed in the room. A private room, then, without any windows. No doubt it was because of his status as a villain. He couldn't make heads or tails of where he was hooked up or if it was showing about him, but he didn't notice he at least had a heart monitor and an IV drip of something. Hopefully it was pain medication because Hisashi felt like his body had been used as a chew toy by something really big with really sharp teeth. Getting the urge to close his eyes again, Hisashi paused and squinted as he saw a blurry outline of a jacket retangled. Careful of everything he was hooked up to, Hisashi carefully poked at the outline and felt smooth glass. It was a phone, he guessed, and judging by the cracked screen, it was his phone. Hisashi snatched it up in an instant, wincing at the extra light on his already battered eyes. He could at least squint enough to find out the time and date. Nodding to himself as he saw it was 3 in the afternoon. That wasn't too bad, but it was the date that showed tomorrow's date that had him almost falling into another panic attack. Had he really been unconscious for over 24 hours? He couldn't even call in sleeping when he still felt so exhausted. Fuck. He was gonna have to be at work and he didn't have to be able to call in. Wondering if he could still fix it, Hisashi squinched and worked his phone one-handed, wincing at the pressure it put on his IV needle. It wasn't like he could use his other hand through seeing as if he was, handcuffed. Right, okay. Message from his boss. Ah, multiple messages. That was never a good sign. His quick scan through showed that, if nothing else, he would have a lot of free time in the future. Being fired over the phone was a new low, even for that slimy little bastard. Oh, right. His identity had been broadcasted over national television, hadn't it? Hisashi took a shaky breath through his nose, trying to stay calm as he went over the facts. So far, he had been asleep for over a day. He was chained to a hospital bed, had been outed as a villain, and had just been fired from his job. His phone was also flashing a low battery symbol and about to die in his hands as his head pounded from all the lights and unnerving silence starting to get to him. He was just starting to think it couldn't get any worse when he saw the door open. Hisashi dropped his phone and his arms, screwing his eyes shut and falling back to lean against the absurd number of pillows behind him, and now almost grateful for his missing hearing aids. At least now he could pull off whatever lecture was coming, whether it was from the police or the doctors or some weird mix of the two. There was silence, as always, and Hisashi started bracing himself before the lights were off. Cracking his eyes open, Hisashi saw nothing but blissful darkness and a vague, shadowy shape moving around the room. Maybe if he closed his eyes again, he could pretend to be asleep. It was better than anything else, seeing as now his eyes were burning. That officially left no part of his body that wasn't hurting, and Hisashi was almost frustrated enough to start crying. But before he could give in to the urge, there was the feeling of soft, dim light filling the room, and then the feeling of hands on his arms, and Hisashi had to fight not to jerk away as he felt something cold and wet dripping around the needle. It took a moment, but Hisashi realized that he must have caused some bleeding where he had his arm bent earlier, and the doctor or nurse was wiping away the blood. At least they weren't trying to ask him questions. Or, if they were, Hisashi didn't hear them. His phone was taken next, Hisashi hoping that it was at least just set down again instead of taken away from him altogether. Starting to relax, Hisashi tensed back up as he felt something touch his ear. And he really did not like that. Looking like I'm going to kill you. Oi, can you hear me? I don't know how these things are supposed to work. The low, sleepy drawl of Aizawa Shota had Hisashi jerking back up, eyes wide before they were focusing on a pair of glasses held in front of him. Sorry, I couldn't find any of your sunglasses. Aw, Eraser, that's so sweet of you. Hisashi had tried to say, seeing as the second he started talking, it felt as his throat was on fire. No noise escaping besides a broken, jaggled whimper, and his hearing aid picked up all too well. Hey, easy. Hisashi felt a warm, steady hand rub circles on his back, and then the feeling of a plastic straw against his lips. Hisashi focused on the straw first, sucking down water and, again, almost crying. It was almost worrying how strong and often the urge was getting. Hisashi mused to himself before taking a few moments to try and steady himself. I know this might be an impossible task for you, but don't try to speak for a while. Aizawa's voice was low, concerned, mumbled, soft and easy on his hearing as the man worked on hooking his other hearing aid around his ear. There are some spare aids that the hospital had. The doctor said you should know how to adjust them yourself. Settling for giving a shaky thumbs up, Hisashi took another sip of water before pushing the cup away. As Aizawa set it back up on the nightstand, Hisashi took a moment to fiddle with his hearing aids one by one, softening the sound and giving another thumbs up. When they were at the right level, they roughly should be. Right. Nod or shake your head. Do you remember why you're here? Straight to the point as always. His hero. Hisashi nodded, noticing that Aizawa hadn't removed his hand from his back. He was still rubbing little circles against Hisashi's spine, small and soft as if he didn't even realize he was doing it. Hisashi made absolute sure he wasn't going to cry at the soft touch before leaning into it, making a mental note to blame whatever he was on the IV drip later. Remembering he had been asked a question, Hisashi nodded in answering, noticing a bit of tension leaking out of the man. Good. That means you know what I'm talking about when I call you an absolute idiot. Well, that was a little harsh. As soon as you're out of this hospital, I'm going to give you an entire lecture I give my students in the first week of class about how not to be a dumbass. An entire lecture? Huh. That sounded like it could be fun if Aizawa was a teacher. Feeling a light pinch in his back, Hisashi gave the man an exaggerated pout, swearing he saw Aizawa blushing. It had to have been the pain meds. You and Nemuri are too much alike, I swear. Nemuri. Oh, right. Midnight. What hurts the most right now? Hisashi pointed to his throat without pause, a bit worried at Aizawa's expression. It was a frown, as was the usual with him, but he also looked so worried. Hisashi resisted the urge to clear his throat or try to talk again, instead waiting for Aizawa to speak first. He was almost surprised he didn't have to wait a century for that to happen. You overused your quirk, but you also... Do you remember the end of the fight? Right as me and Midnight got there? Thinking about it and making a face, Hisashi wriggled his hands to try and convey a sort of. They had you pinned. Ah, they had, hadn't they? Let's see. Hisashi remembered feeling a lot of pain. He remembered seeing Eraserhead and then the disappearance of that awful shield, and then Hisashi touched his fingers to his throat for the first time, feeling thick bandages wrapped around his neck. Bandages like these. Bandages like this wouldn't be used just for bruising. They managed to directly attack your neck since they were trying to stop you from using your quirk. You were in surgery for a while last night and early this morning. Stopping him from using his quirk, huh? Depends on how they did that. It was quite possible a miracle that Hisashi was still... You're lucky you're alive, Aizawa mumbled, soft and quiet, and hand on his back forming a fist that was clutched at Hisashi's hospital gown. Since he was unable to speak, Hisashi settled for turning his head just enough to kiss at that scar under Aizawa's eyes, pulling back after a moment and biting his lip. There was a second where Aizawa blinked, looking surprised and completely off guard before Hisashi felt lips pressed against his own, soft and sweet and so unlike the first and last kiss they had shared. Hisashi wasn't sure how long it lasted, whether it was a second or a lifetime, but when Aizawa pulled back, he looked a lot less stressed, rubbing at Hisashi's back again. The two were both silent for a few moments before Aizawa finally straightened up, moving to pull a chair over and take a seat in it. The kids are all right, by the way. All of them were accounted for, and none of them have more than a scratch or two. Aizawa was a mind reader, and Hisashi had never been happier for that. It felt like, although he was a little bummed that Aizawa was no longer so close and rubbing his back because that had been nice, they also made a card for you. Wait, what? Hisashi looked over to see Aizawa was holding up a little cardboard card with a cartoon of a bird with yellow chest on it. Aizawa then flipped it open, and Hisashi saw that it was scribbled over with all kinds of words, and addressed to Mr. Hero. In the end, Hisashi figured he couldn't be blamed for crying at that. Taking a minute or two to wipe at his eyes, Hisashi startled and looked over when he saw Aizawa's hands moving. Oh, I know sign, by the way. Aizawa signed, and then looked back to Hisashi with a smirk. Hisashi wasn't sure if he wanted to punch him or drag him back over for another kiss. Oh, who was he kidding? He definitely wanted to drag him back over for another kiss. Sadly, though, it seemed that would have to wait. Moving to finally ask the question he had, Hisashi winced and dropped his shoulders when he felt the hand that was handcuffed draw up short. So much for signing. Maybe he could pout enough that Aizawa would feel pity and pick the lock like he was already doing. Wait, what? I don't even know why they cuffed you. Aizawa mumbled. Hisashi's heart sped up at how close the man was as he leaned over to him, getting at the lock. Where did he even find locking pick tools? Did he just carry those around? Shit. The device monitor, his heart rate was getting louder. It's not like you're about to run for it. Okay, good. Aizawa didn't seem to notice. At least that's what Hisashi thought before the man was giving him a quick, nowhere near as soft kiss, smirking at him when Hisashi's heart rate shot up again. And this man was a horrible human being. You're awful, Hisashi sighed as soon as he could, glaring at Aizawa as he sat back down and looking smug. Are all those kids really alright? What's been happening while I've been out? Uh, well, Aizawa trailed off, scratching at the scuff of his cheek, not quite looking at him. Hisashi didn't like that. He really didn't like that. The kids are safe, but Japan seems to be heralding the rise of the newest hero, Present Mike. Japan what now? Apparently, Present Mike is one of the most promising new heroes on the scene in a while. Aizawa looked back at him, expression softening to a smile as he gave a quiet laugh. The kids were interviewed, and they promised to start a fan club for you. Oh, yeah, your hero rank right now is 47, by the way. This time, it took a lot longer for Hisashi to stop crying, Aizawa only smiling at him, and mentioning little pieces of information from time to time as he tried to calm down. It wasn't anything as big as being the number 46 in all of Japan amongst heroes, but it was nice, little things. Aizawa's homeroom class had wanted to throw some kind of slumber party with the kids from the other classes and had managed to break every window on the first floor. Shinsou had intervented his own move with the binding cloth that Aizawa used as Eraserhead, and then used it on him. Aizawa let him know he was equally annoyed and proud. Midnight, too, came up, Aizawa mentioning that she had been blowing up his phone every few hours asking for updates. Overall, the man had just kept talking. He sounded bored and tired as always, but he never let there be too long of a moment of silence. It was enough to make Hisashi cry a few more times longer than he probably should have. Finally, he got control of himself to start fingerspelling out eraser, startling when Aizawa shook his head before Hisashi felt his heart almost stop when he heard the words, "Just call me Shouta." Hisashi stared, unable to even try to say anything because he would really give Hisashi a gift like that. They had been villain and hero for so long, and yet here he would give Hisashi the gift of using his given name. Just like that. Oh, right. Here's how you sign it. As with most sign language, names are made up of different signs that give them a personalized feel and help distinguish them. Hisashi had to cover his mouth and fight not to laugh, though because the signs Shota used for his name were the signs for cat and sleep. Oi, oi, stop laughing. Shota complained, looking more amused than upset. Student gave it to me a few years ago and I was too lazy to even bother changing it is all. More like you liked that student too much to bother changing it. The silence was an answer all itself. Hisashi supposed. Fine, but you have to call me by my own name. Fingerspelling his name. First, Hisashi followed it with his own personalized signs. The ones for microphone and sun. Hisashi. Shota was grinning in a way that made it seem as if he knew something Hisashi didn't. Yet, and Yamada Hizashi, the civilian barista who Eraserhead had saved and then helped home, that meant he knew. Oh, before you try and panic again, I knew it was you the night I helped you with your shoulder. I knew it! I knew you were too smug about something that night. Hisashi had been worrying himself to death over that night, and so, of course, Shota had already known everything. That meant he was fully aware of who Hisashi was when he told him he could be a hero. He he had known the entire time. Yeah, I knew. Shota knew all too well what he had been saying and who he had been saying it to, and he still had believed every word of it. Looks like I was right, though. Hisashi covered his mouth for a moment, remembering those quiet words of, I have a feeling you would be an amazing hero, Yamada. Trying not to cry, because he really had done far too much of that already. Hisashi instead dropped his hands and gave a small smile, and carefully signed. My cat name is Snowball, in case you forgot. Mine is Jelly. Shota laughed, a warm and fond smile on his face. It seems like a good idea at the time. Hisashi was so stupidly in love with this man, half ready to say as much. Both paused when there was a knock on the door. Hisashi swallowed, as he saw it open to reveal an older man who was going gray and, after a second glance, showed he was no doubt the doctor for this ward. Hisashi was already bracing himself for when he saw the man reach to turn on the lights. Leave it off, Shota spoke up, startling the doctor and Hisashi both. He has light sensitivity. What do you need? Oh, Eraser, you're still here. Good. The doctor walked in and fluttered around the bed for a minute or two, checking on everything and jotting around notes in an annoyingly silent way until he was done. Can I talk to you out in the hall for a moment? Sure. Shota sighed, standing up with a little grumble, not moving away from Hisashi until the doctor was halfway back the door. Hisashi appreciated it more than he could currently say. He had a feeling Shota already knew that. Oh, and he's supposed to be handcuffed, you know? Oh, right. Shota had taken off the handcuffs earlier, hadn't he? Geez. Here he was, beating up and could hardly move, and they were still worried about him and his quirk. He may not be a threat at the moment, but for safety's sake, he'll be good. Shota interrupted, Hisashi trying to figure out what sort of joke he could make before he felt fingers slim along his jaw, tilting his gaze up to where he met Shota's, the man giving him a look that had him shivering, words drawn out, low and quiet. Won't you? In that moment, Hisashi realized there was very little he wouldn't be willing to do when Shota asked him like that. He was quick to nod, flushing as Shota ducked in to press lips against his temple, soft words, nearly a whisper against his skin that sounded out a soft, good boy. A second later, and Shota was walking to the door, perfectly composed and parallel to the strained old wheezing sound Hisashi was making as he patted his cheeks, staring down at his blanket as the door was left cracked open. He tried to gather his thoughts together because, while he certainly hadn't known he was into something like that, he was definitely into something like that. Right, okay, he needed to focus. Actually, he should probably try to listen to what the doctor was saying to Shota. It took a bit of fiddling with his hearing aids, but with the door cracked, Hisashi was able to make out what they were talking about. His quirk. The words getting a bit lower, with one of them bumped into the door, and it opened a bit more. At this point, it's safe to say that there's little doubt that he's lost the ability to use his quirk. Oh, they must have been talking about someone else. One of the villains had fought, maybe? Hisashi wondered what had happened. Shota's voice was hard to hear when he was so quiet, but Hisashi still managed to catch all of it. There's still a chance, though. Well, there's always a chance, Eraserhead, but realistically? Damn, Hisashi almost felt sorry for whoever this was. There's also the matter of recovering his normal voice as well. There's a very real chance he might not be able to effectively speak again. Hisashi swallowed, slowly lifting a hand to trace at the bandages around his throat. Someone else must have hurt the throat at the fight, too, then. Hisashi wouldn't be surprised. It had been a chaotic end. He remembered that he himself had been pinned down, and he remembered the shield falling. One of the villains, though, had a spike quirk, and Hisashi remembered just vaguely feeling like he'd been strangled before there had been a sharp stinging coming from his neck. It had hurt. Even with how exhausted and painful everything was, it was that sharp, stinging pain from his neck that had hurt so much. Strangely enough, after that, it felt like he'd been drowning, and he couldn't tell if it was memory or imagination that made him remember hearing Shota scream his name. He had been strangled, then a sharp sting, and then the feeling of drowning, and then Shota screaming his name. Hisashi felt the bandages around his neck again. They really were too thick, just to cover up some bruises. It made more sense if they were covering up some sort of cut. Shota said he had been in surgery, too. If his neck had been cut deep enough, then whoever they were talking about in the hallway could have been him. It wasn't, though. It couldn't. He was fine. He was fine. Hisashi. Jolting at the quiet, panicked sound of his name, Hisashi shouldered as he felt Shota's hand cup his cheek and wipe his tears away. It seemed Hisashi had been crying again. How much did you hear? Ah, and there it was. Hisashi couldn't lie to himself any longer as he wanted, but he had never quite been able to lie to Eraserhead, and Shota could never lie, too. Who am I without my voice? He hated his voice and quirk more than anything in the world some days, and had spent so long running away from them. But it was who he was. He was the voice hero? The voice. Who am I without my quirk? His hands were shaking, but Hisashi couldn't stop himself from trying to ask the question. It wasn't like he'd ever been able to speak his question again, a fact that made everything hurt as much as he tried to steady his breath through his tears. Does that make me better now, Shota? Does it make me better now that I don't have a quirk? That's probably better, isn't it? To be quirkless rather than a villain? It wasn't fair, though. Hisashi hadn't even gotten the chance to change before it was all over for him. Maybe this was for the best, right? It's probably better. Hisashi startled as his hands were grabbed and held softly, fingers linking with his before Hisashi felt lips nudge and press against his own, giving him a distraction that he didn't hesitate to take. This time, Hisashi pressed back just as much as Shota, freeing his hands and wrapping them around Shota's shirt, tugging him closer, too scared to pull away and ask what this was meant for. It was a lot longer than they've pulled away this time. Hisashi still practically shaking and crying, breathing hitched, when he felt Shota kiss at his tears still rolling down his cheeks. Hisashi didn't even try and ask any other questions before Shota was asking one himself, voice sounding as wrecked as Hisashi's would if he could still speak. Go out with me? Not even Hisashi could pretend Shota meant that as anything that it was. There was no way to confuse the fact that Shota, even after all this, still wanted him. Hisashi was near sobbing when he managed to bring his hands up to sign yes over and over until Shota grabbed his hand and pulled him into a kiss that was harder than all the ones before. It was rough, hard, utterly consuming, and impossible to think of anything else. Hisashi couldn't find it within him to do anything but press back, hands gripping at Shota's tight enough to, no doubt, leave bruises. That was okay, though. It was all okay. Hisashi didn't need his hands or voice to speak to Shota, after all. He knew, without a doubt, just like every other time, Shota heard him loud and clear. Wow! Okay, I'm not crying, you're crying. I believe in happily ever after. We're 2 chapters away. This isn't seeming like a happily ever after. Alright? I need to talk to your manager. Right now. Because... Okay, I need to breathe. Cry. Alright. Oh my god. Hisashi can lose his quirk. Do I think he's gonna lose his quirk? I don't know. Normally I know what's gonna happen next, or I have a small theory or whatever. I could go into the author's mind. I don't know what's gonna happen. Is he gonna lose his quirk? Is he not gonna lose his quirk? He very well can become the first, quirkless hero. Okay. Whew. Breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out. You could do this, you could do this. This was a very sweet chapter. They're finally official with the whole, go out with me kind of thing. I think it's kind of sweet. Their whole little... Do I think that they had chemistry in this chapter? Yes. But in the sense of less of like, oh, you could tell they love each other, and more of the sense of like bittersweet, like, oh, this seems like a couple who is going through a really rough patch right now because, one of them is in the hospital, and, it's giving that bittersweet, I love you even if, I love you for better or for worse, in sickness or in health. I'm gonna cry again. I need to stop. I'm gonna make myself cry. Okay. Also, can we talk about that whole, Aizawa, what was that whole, you'll be good, won't you? Good boy. I'm sorry. I'm sipping on my water. That was something. That was something. This whole chapter was something. I think that was the only point where it was, genuine chemistry without the underlying of, sickness and health kind of thing, right? Well, the other part of the whole chapter, it's that bittersweet sickness and in health kind of thing where the dynamic kind of switched over. Hisashi's the silent one now, with Aizawa keeping, keep talking and not having it be as silent. And it really shows how Aizawa really genuinely cares for Hisashi, right? And it's just, my heart. It's, as I said, it's that bittersweet in sickness and in health kind of thing. That bittersweet, you show the person you love them so much, even though seeing them in pain is hurting you as well kind of love. And it's just, my heart. It's heart-wrenching. It's just grabbing at my heart and just yanking it. I'm gonna cry. I'm gonna cry. I'm probably gonna sob after this. Also, the heart monitor. Never again. Never again. Because I had to manually make it, what's it called? Speed up. So, if you guys notice that little thingy, I hope you know that in itself took me 30 minutes. Because I couldn't find one that I liked that was sped up, so I'm like, okay, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna speed it up and slow it down. Speed it up and slow it down. Whenever I want to, kind of thing. In some moments, it was automatic speed up, and other moments it was a slow build up, like at that end, when Hisashi is starting to realize, oh, I'm the one they're talking about. That slow build up, because he's slowly coming with that realization. Completely different from the out of nowhere just beep 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 when he starts getting flustered, because that's a quick change kind of thing, hopefully you like that, because I did not like editing that. But as always, my raindrops, make sure to eat, sleep, drink water, take your meds, have a wonderful day or night. Link to my socials and Discord server are in the description. Subscribe to see more of my content, and thank you so much for watching.